I grew up and live in a small town in Florida. And Florida isn't just a tropical paradise, like most ads promote it to be. In fact, you go more than a mile from either coast, and you'll just run into swampland. Dank, murky, humid swampland, with thick brush composed of palmetto bushes, sawgrass, miserable sandy patches, and annoying Brazilian pepper plants. In order to make the land livable, canals had to be dug. They drained the swamp water and turned the land from soppy, squishy mud to shifting sand and dirt. Though not ideal, with the right construction techniques, it was workable enough, and houses and towns began to spring up. My hometown is one, and I grew up less than a half mile away from one such canal. To be clear, the canal wasn't a small brook or stream. It lay at the bottom of a ravine, and on the other side lay a large field surrounded by barbed wire fences, a cow pasture, which was very common in the area. Growing up in a suburb surrounded by cow pastures, there was little in the way of exploration and wilderness. My friends and I would often venture to the canal to go fishing, ride our bikes alongside it, and just generally mess around. The canal system made for a good series of shortcuts as well. As a kid that grew up in the 90s, the internet wasn't nearly as big as it was now, so when the series of incidents happened, I had very few resources to figure it out. Even now that the internet has become far more accessible, it still doesn't answer many of my questions. The earliest incident that I have memory of occurred when I was 11. I was on one of my routine bike rides. The hot summer sun was starting to fade into the evening, but it was still strong enough that I could feel its heat. The music I was listening to beat into my ears as I moved down the path at a decent speed, though I couldn't go too fast as there were potholes and pits all over, and I was forced to weave around them. I yelped, and flinched as a small figure appeared in front of me suddenly. Me being startled and the shock made my bike swerve. I grunted as I fell to the side and slid a short distance. I groaned and looked up. I was slightly shaken, but fine. But then a wave of confusion hit me as I saw no one there. The brief time I saw the figure and running into the ground, what I could tell was it looked to be the size of a child. It happened so fast that I wasn't able to get much detail though. And what I could discern was that they had brown or bronze-colored skin and dark hair. More than a little shaken, I gathered my bike and pedaled away from there as fast as I could. A shiver up my spine propelled me to increase my speed. A few months passed, and the experience was still a bit fresh in my mind. I couldn't quite shake it, and while it was unsettling, it more stirred a curiosity inside my mind. So, I set out for the canal on an early Saturday morning, before the day got too hot. There were houses on the side of the canal that I rode on, and of course on the other was the cow pasture. However, heading down the canal would eventually lead into another pasture, so, not knowing anywhere else to go, I headed towards it. I didn't really have any idea what I was looking for. I just felt a compulsion to search for anything or something. I neared the barbed wire that outlined the field, and saw a sign that showed who owned the land. I looked around, and I spotted someone standing near a tree, and they were hunched over. I was too far away to make out any distinct features, though I could tell that this person was of the same heritage as the kid I had spotted a few months earlier. Only this person was obviously older, quite a bit to be precise, and looked to be working on something or searching for something. For reasons unknown to me, a twinge of cold slid down my back, and I shook a bit as that unsettling feeling I'd felt months earlier had returned. I was still kind of curious, though. The person stood beyond the barbed wire, and I had no inclination of going over it. So I felt relatively safe that I could get away if this person decided to do anything. So I shouted to them. They didn't respond. The unsettling chill returned with far more potency, and the urge to leave surged into my mind. The stench of rotten fish and salt water suddenly appeared. It filled my nose and made me start to feel sick. I turned around to head back, as I had had enough. That's when my heart nearly jumped out of my chest. The figure I had been watching was standing behind me, and I nearly bumped into him. He yelled, and I fell on my back and tried to scramble away from him. I blinked, and felt like my breath had been stolen away, and I fought to regain it. As quickly as I had closed and opened my eyes to blink, the man was gone. Far more shaken than I was before, I leapt to my feet and sprinted home, not daring to look back. Though I was quite scared and startled, I had managed to get a better look at this figure than the one I had seen months before. I remember that he had long black hair that was going gray, and it was all rolled up behind his head. His eyes were brown, and held a rage and a sadness that, the more I thought about it, the more it unnerved me. The incident in the morning obviously plagued my mind the rest of the day. I did my best to relax and try to bury it, but I had no idea if what I saw was some kind of apparition or my mind going crazy. Even though I wasn't quite old enough to fully understand mental disorders, the thought that this was likely a flicker of insanity was more terrifying than it being some kind of specter. Those thoughts seemed to swirl around in my brain, and I tried to research what I had seen. Yet I could find very little. The only thing I could figure that it was some kind of Native American, yet I couldn't identify much beyond that, and eventually gave up searching. Every now and then, though, those two figures would surface in my mind, and I would quickly fight to put them away. The more time went on with our incident, the easier it became to ignore those thoughts. I made it a point to not return to that canal, and I changed my bike route accordingly. Eventually, I shrugged it off as just some kind of one-off hallucination, or some kind of temporary insanity. I didn't know how else to explain it. I would be proven dead wrong, nearly a year and a half later. It had been a long day of homework and chores, so when it was time to go to sleep that night, it only took me a few minutes of lying in bed before I began to feel really tired. My eyes quickly became heavy with sleep, and I started to close them. A dark figure stood in my window. It appeared just before my eyelids closed, so I thought I had just imagined it. When I rubbed my eyes and opened them more to make sure, my stomach twisted. The silhouette leaned forward, and I felt a strong wave of dread crash over me as the thing moved through the window. It made no noise, and it moved as if the window and the wall beneath it were not there. I wanted to scream. I wanted to yell, to call for help. Yet, I felt as though if I did, some unfathomable, horrific fate would come upon me. Fear had seized my nerves, and I dared not scream or make any sound. It wasn't until the thing had entered my bedroom did I recognize the shape to be of a similar figure to the ones I'd seen before. It was hidden by the darkness of my room as it approached my bed, though I could tell this one was younger than the one I had previously encountered, but older than the first. Dear God, I thought my heartbeat was fast before, but I could barely hear anything beyond my breathing and the beat in my chest this time. The overwhelming smell of rotten salt water forced itself into my lungs as the figure looked at me. The ghastly intruder extended its hand, and I shivered in fear as I felt its fingertips brush my face. Intense fear surged through my blood and made me want to flee, yet at the same time, it kept me from doing so. Strange mutterings and whispers from an alien language long since dead came from this entity. Confusion and malice were both mixed into its strange dialect as it stroked my face a few times. Wait, it wasn't malice, at least not entirely. It almost felt like admiration or sadness. I couldn't tell. It was like this thing both despised and adored me at the same time. The phantom stroked my face for only a few moments before it backed away from me and stood in the middle of my room. Gaining some distance, I began to feel like there might be a chance to run to the safety of my parents. My closed bedroom door was only about 2.5 yards away. I slowly moved my hand to the edge of my blankets, ready to fling them aside so I wouldn't get tripped up when I ran. I forced myself to focus, to push through the paralyzing fear. I did not want to stick around any longer. The figure started to chant some ancient prayer or incantation and swayed on its feet. The voice was low and haunting and lightly echoed through my room. My breathing grew in depth and intensity as I looked over at my escape, my bedroom door. Each second felt like a few minutes as I quickly threw my sheets aside and leapt out of my bed towards the door and reached for the handle. A loud yell of rage came from my visitor as I grasped the door handle and turned it. I wasted no time in flinging it open and sprinted out of there. As I ran, I heard a thud hit my door, and I continued bounding down the hall into the living room. My parents were still awake, and they were both running towards my room as they had heard the commotion. I leapt into my mom's arms, yelling and crying at the same time, and my dad continued into my room. I looked up and saw my bedroom light come on, and in a few moments my dad walked out. "There's nothing there," he said, as he gave me an odd look. "Wait, what's on your face?" I touched my cheek and felt something slick and cool. A twinge of nervousness sprung up in me as I ran to the bathroom and looked in the mirror. Black markings covered my face in a distinct pattern, like some kind of ceremonial face paint. My mom rushed and grabbed a camera, took a few pictures of my face before it was washed off. It took me about a week before I was able to sleep in my room again. It took a couple more on top of that before I was able to sleep on my own. Oh, and that thud I had heard? I don't really know what it was. The only thing I found was a slit in my door that looked like something had been driven into it. As I said before, even with the help of the internet years later, I was barely able to find anything about what specifically had happened to me. And ever since that night, I've been seeing what I can only assume to be some kind of Native American spirits. I did manage to learn about one tribe that had vanished in the mid-1700s that was said to have lived in the area. They were called the Eyes, but little record exists of them, so I really can't be certain if they're the ones I've been seeing. The phantoms would appear at the oddest and most inexplicable times. These phantoms would appear at the oddest and most inexplicable times. They've also disappeared just as quickly and oddly as they had come. Just a few weeks ago, I saw what looked to be a young, expecting woman when I was fishing with a friend of mine. She was standing in the water and looked to be gathering things. I knew it was one of the spirits because when I looked back over at her, she was gone instantly. without so much as a sound or splash. While I haven't yet had another traumatizing incident like that night years ago, I still get anxious, and not knowing if something like that will happen again. All I can say is, don't go near the canals.